we've got all these protests going around all over the country. They're kind of dying down because the cops are finally doing something about them. But we've been seeing in America, and this is kind of spread to other campuses across the world, but it started in America. We've been seeing these pro-Palestine / pro-Hamas protests. And the reason why I say / pro-Hamas is because some of these folks, including leaders of these protests, have been pro-Hamas or they've refused to condemn Hamas. I actually went and looked before I did this stream, and I have not found a single pro-Palestinian protest from these gatherings where there were members of the protest on the Palestinian side who were condemning Hamas while also criticizing Israel, which I think is it's a balanced take to criticize Hamas and Israel because they both have been doing things wrong. Now, who has the most malice? I would say Hamas. I know a lot of people would probably disagree with that take, but oh well, there it is. I think there are a few things to take into account with the whole protest, and it's very polarizing. However, this is what I'll say. First of all, the majority of these protests have been peaceful. I mean, people haven't been running around like attacking others. Now, UCLA was a different story. We did see a bunch of violence there in large part because there were violent pro-Israel protesters who were there to counter-protest. And I'm not sure if those protesters got attacked first or they went and tried to attack the pro-Hamas protesters. I'm not sure what exactly happened there, but it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. And I'll do a video about this separately because it got so bad that like a Jewish girl was beaten by like a crowd of these pro-Hamas protesters and she ended up having to be taken to the hospital. I think she got at least a concussion, if not other injuries. But I just wanted to go through some more details because I also have big problems with these protests. Not just that they are promoting Hamas, which from what I can tell in general they do, but also because they are, in my opinion, doing what amounts to terrorism on domestic soil, not just from a Encyclopedia Britannica perspective, but from what the FBI themselves would tell you. But let's slowly go through everything that's been happening at a very high level first, and then I'll get to my conclusion. So, we've got some examples here of people. We got a lot of things going on. So here's a clip from a leader of a protest, which to be fair is happening in Australia, but here she is refusing to condemn Hamas, same as the person who was with her here.
You kind of have to condemn Hamas or talk about Hamas. It's a distraction from the issue at hand, which is actually there's a genocide going on. And, Hamas...
But Israel wouldn't say it's a distraction. They would say that they're undertaking this action because Hamas kidnapped and still hold Israelis hostage, and they're demanding... Now, I'm not for one moment defending Israel's actions. I mean, let's face it. I mean, how many children do you want to kill before everything stops? But surely, if you're going to protest against that, you've also got to send a message to Hamas to release the hostages, don't you?
Well, I actually say that Hamas deserve our unconditional support, not because I agree with their strategy. Absolutely. Not because I agree with their strategy. Complete disagreements with that. But the situation at hand is, if you have no hope, if you are sanctioned every day of your life, if you're told you're not allowed to drive down a road because somebody who is Israeli gets to have preference and you sit there for 12 hours, the reality of life in Palestine...
that can't justify what they did in October last year.
Nothing can justify what has been happening to the Palestinian people for 75 years, right? And essentially, the UN coming in with the situation of a two-state solution, the history of that place, of Palestine, the Palestinians before the UN came in with the two-state solution actually were also under an English mandate, right? Okay. Palestinians were promised that they would have self-determination.
But you can't condemn what Hamas did in October last year?
I will not condemn what Hamas did. We must be unconditional, but we must be critical also, right?
That's insane to me. That we've got this literal pro-Hamas person who is at the forefront of one of these major protests, to be fair, it's in Australia, but still, is literally saying we have to unconditionally support Hamas, which is kind of crazy. And we've got more clips here. This is from a protester in Iowa State University saying that he supports Hamas.
It's a yes or no question. It's a very simple yes or no question. Do you support Hamas?
Yeah.
Which is crazy, absolutely crazy, especially considering. Remember, this is a they're designated terror group. I think that it's fair to also call them a government because they do form as a functional government of Gaza, but they are viewed as a terrorist group for the horrendous things that they do. The IDF has not, done brutal assaults on women in the same way that that Hamas has. Hamas literally had things to say, hey, assault women in this way. When you go in, like little pamphlets that were left behind by the terrorists telling them to do these things. You don't see anything like that from the IDF. So to equate the two or say that somehow Israel is worse than Hamas is kind of crazy. Let's see here. We've also got more. There was a protester who was seen wearing a Hamas headband. Now, from what I could tell, this was just one. It wasn't like a trend or anything. But as you can see here, that headband is extremely similar to the headbands that we've seen here worn by Hamas militants in Gaza. It's actually almost identical. It seems like a intentionally faithful replica. We've also got this clip here of a protester threatening to kill counter-protesters.
You got a microphone? Back up. Hey! I'll break your face! I'll break your face! I bet you! I'll break your face! I'll kill your ass! Yeah. You gotta go. With these! You're provoking me. Yeah, with these! They got it! They go over there! They go over there! They got it! Nah! They gotta go over there! Why he still over here? No, why is he still over here? But why is he still over here? Get an education. Suck my white. You white. You're a white. I will whoop your ass. When I catch you. When I catch you. Get your tweezers out. Catch you. Why would I catch you? Why would I catch you? Why would I catch you?
So clearly not all of these protesters are peaceful, as you can see. Now, there was more violence in UCLA, where the UCLA, they attacked a counter-protester who had a sign that said, Hamas protesters are not welcome on native lands. Which, like, by the way, fighting over a sign is just wild. Let me just say that. That's insane. Now, from what I remember of coverage of this, many people were kind of blaming the university for not bringing in law enforcement because they could have kept these groups separated. Now it's insane. Like this just evolved into chaos. Now I will say what I think is even more disturbing than this is calls for intifada that we've been seeing at various campuses.
Revolution! Intifada revolution! There is only one solution! Intifada revolution!
So and it's not just here. It's here. And yet another instance of this happening. And I did find this kind of funny. There was a UCLA protester who called for intifada, but then didn't, and also said that genocide was bad, but wasn't able to define either of these terms.
You guys are shouting for intifada? You know what an intifada is? What is it?
What is an intifada? You guys are proud of shouting for intifada?
Yo, this looks like when you're like playing a video game and then you see like these like NPCs and you want to talk to them, but then like you don't see any interact buttons, so they're just standing there looking at you. Like they do look like literal NPCs, like from a video game.
They told me that I am free to walk in as I please, so I'm just gonna scoot on by. You can't do that, dude. It's public property.
That's insane. That's insane. And yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff about that there. But, you know, many people who have survived terror attacks did, they found it very upsetting that people are calling for an intifada. Which makes a lot of sense because if you guys aren't familiar with the background, intifadas are basically, it's like Arabic for uprising, I believe. And it's when Palestinians in Gaza would rise up against either like Israelis or Jews, attacking them, usually in retaliation to, you know, instigations from Israel or just due to frustrations on the living situation. And it's just born out of the tensions between the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I'm not really going to get into all of the specifics of all that, but in many cases, the violence wasn't necessarily warranted. Like it wasn't necessarily like people were attacking them, so it was self-defense. It wasn't anything like that. And also many of the groups, by the way, who would do the intifadas were people who were anti-Semitic. So now you're calling for another anti-Semitic attack against the people of Israel. Now, to be fair to them, to these people here, I don't know that they're anti-Semitic because now I guess you do have to ask them questions because many of them are supporting Hamas, right? Which is an anti-Semitic group trying to kill Jews. But at the same time, you know, you can say that you want, you know, Israel to be obliterated from the face of the map and not be anti-Semitic. Now, it does make it more questionable because it's the only Jewish state. So it'd be different if, like, you know, someone was like, oh, I want Liberia to be wiped off of the face of the map. Liberia has no right to exist. Free Liberia from the east to the west. No one would call you racist against Africans because there are other African nations. But when it comes to Israel, there's only one Jewish nation. So there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. You know, it's very, very difficult to also be against Israel while not partnering up with anti-Semites. Like I've been seeing like alt-right people online being against Israel and supporting the far leftists because they hate Jews. So there's a lot of horseshoe theory going on. If you're not familiar with horseshoe theory, it's basically where like the left and the right basically are the same and they meet up and have very similar goals and aims. We're seeing that here. We're seeing things now done by left-wingers and progressives that would it would bring a tear to Nick Fuentes' eye in a happy way if he were to see what some of these people are calling for. Now, some people are calling all of these protests anti-Semitic, right? The Guardian, they put out an article that kind of paints these protesters as anti-Semitic. I'm not sure if all of them are anti-Semitic, but I do understand the concerns there. But to be fair, it's apparently funded by Jews. The protests are apparently funded by Jews, or at least George Soros. He is allegedly, according to the New York Post, paying some of the student group or funding the student groups that are behind these events. Now, there's a lot of information here that you can go through, but essentially, we've been seeing some paid protesters or people who accused of being paid protesters at many of these venues. As you know, as people record, they've been identifying some folks. Lot of information here, and there's a lot of stuff to get to, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but I do recommend checking out this article here if you have the time to do so. Now, in general, because, we have to talk about the response to this, right? Because, if a bunch of protesters come into your campus and keep students from going to school, especially largely Jewish students, where to the point where many Jewish students almost feel like, all the non-Jewish students can go to class, but the Jewish ones can't. We have to talk about some responses to the protests. Now, in general, the university presidents have given vague and bland condemnations of the protests, but not really speaking on what it is that they're protesting in regards to. And that makes sense considering the fact that these protesters are violating school rules and school policies. To be fair, at the very least, Columbia threatened to expel some of these protesters if they stopped holding a building hostage, which is literally something that they did. I'm not making this up. This is coming straight from Axios. Now, I have not seen any evidence that they followed through on this threat. And I'm not sure if I'm rooting for them to do so, but I think that maybe a 1 or 2 year suspension would be fair. You got to give them time to cool off, because generally with these things is give them 4 years and then see if the protests is still around. Usually the movement is far gone. Where's Black Lives Matter? They're gone. Now this kind of brings up one of my biggest problems with these protests is, in many ways, I think these protests resemble, and I think meet the definition of terrorism. So if we look at the Encyclopedia Britannica here, they define terrorism as, quote, the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. Terrorism has been practiced by political organizations with both rightist and leftist objectives, by nationalistic and religious groups, by revolutionaries, and even by state institutions such as armies, intelligence services, and police. And also, if we go to the FBI, it says here, we've got international terrorism, violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups who are inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations or nations, state-sponsored. And we've got domestic terrorism, which is violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences, such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. Now, I think that the reason why many of these protests amount to this is because they are trying to terrorize the people who are on the campus, right? If we look at it, what are they doing? They're occupying spaces, pretty much as much space as possible, keeping people from going in and out of the buildings. And especially the thing that seals the deal for me is they are threatening to not go away and to not stop unless the universities capitulate to their demands. In some cases, I think, regrettably, many of these universities are actually capitulating to some of their demands. They're saying, okay, we'll give free money to Palestinians. We will have a board meeting to consider joining the BDS movement. And, they're negotiating with the terrorists, which I think is a shame, because we've kind of set a new precedent now that protesters can be extremely disruptive on campus, keep people from going to class, which is literally what they're there to do. They're there to learn, go to class, do the assignments, turn everything in, do the exams, finish the courses, and then get whatever grades they have, get a diploma, and then go into the real world. These protesters or terrorists, depending on whether or not you agree with my assessment here, are not allowing students to do this. They're not. So you've now said, okay, we are going to let people just wreak havoc, do whatever, and then also boss us around. And I think to tell your students, hey, you can get whatever you want if you throw a big enough tantrum, is completely ill-advised and is one thing that will bring the demise of these universities, some of which were previously deemed to be highly esteemed, well-accredited, and elite colleges. I don't know if that's going to be the reputation moving forward. Now to wrap things up, there was one last piece of the story where, to also be fair to these college students, it was found that a shocking amount of people were not even members of the colleges.
4 minutes before the bottom of the hour, Fox News alert, NYPD revealing that of the nearly 300 people arrested on Columbia and City College on New York campuses Tuesday, half of those had no affiliation with either school. At Columbia, outsiders made up nearly 30% of the arrests. City College, that number 60%. As protests continue across the city, our next guest says the faculty at his school are complicit in these protests. He even goes further.
That is true. There are faculty in the protests. In some cases, there were professors who were arrested because they were participating in these often violent protests, but not entirely violent. But yeah, some people are caught up in this mess. This is all very unfortunate and alarming. I will say, thankfully, that these cancerous protests have not spread all across the entire country, and we've actually seen some universities where they responded appropriately to the protests. I think that UT was a shining example of this. I think they only let them be around for like a day, and then they took everything down. They said, hey, we are going to expel you if you don't leave. And so a lot of them left, and some of them had to get arrested anyways. I think it's unfortunate, but thankfully not all universities are going to stand for these types of protests. So we'll see how this affects things. I don't think, by the way, this will affect the United States presidential election, because many of these students don't vote. They will go into the street, they will throw a tantrum when it's time to vote. Nah, they ain't feeling it. Also, they support a very extreme portion of the population when it comes to even like the Democrat Party. If you guys remember the Squad, when the Squad first came in, what they were known for was being anti-Israel, and except for one of them, supporting the BDS movement, which I think around the time they were on the come up, and I think even since then, the BDS movement has largely been considered by some individuals to be at least terrorist sympathetic, because it is a movement that anti-Israel and terrorist nations often call for, which is, hey, divest from any company that does business with Israel. Hopefully that'll ice them out, drain their economy, and they won't be able to defend themselves. Then we'll be able to go and attack them and take them over. It's basically what the BDS movement is hoping to achieve with their protests. But that's not a policy that most people agree with. Most Democrats don't agree with that policy. Basically, no Republicans except for anti-Semites agree with that policy either. So I don't think that this will affect the elections very much. If anything, it'll make people more upset at Democrats, because it sort of puts on display, I think, the ignorance of some of these protesters, their hypocrisy, right? Decrying, violence, but then also basically having terroristic activities on their own campuses. So I don't think this is going to move the needle a lot because they don't vote. But I don't know. We will have to see how this makes people feel about the Democrat Party and about anti-Israel protests in general before we can really make a judgment on how exactly this is going to move the needle.